I watched her place my crown upon her golden head, and I said nothing. I stood there in the great hall of Schönbrunn, surrounded by 200 courtiers whose eyes burned into my skin like hot coals, and I watched Margarethe, beautiful radiant Margarethe, accept the coronation crown that Emperor Leopold had promised to me. The same crown he had slipped onto my finger in miniature form when he proposed marriage in the rose gardens 7 springs ago. The same crown his dying lips had whispered about in our private chambers just 3 weeks prior. And I said nothing. 'Cause what could I say? That I had been a fool. That I had believed a man's promises over the cold reality of royal succession. That love, in the end, meant absolutely nothing when weighed against the preservation of an empire. But here's what they don't tell you in the fairy tales. Sometimes the story doesn't end where you think it does. Sometimes the cruelest betrayal is just the beginning. And sometimes, the son who should hate you becomes the only person in the entire kingdom who sees you for who you truly are. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, if you've ever had someone take credit for your work, your love, your entire existence, stay with me. Drop a comment right now and tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because you're going to need it for what comes next. And if this story grips your heart the way it's gripped mine, subscribe, because betrayal is only the first chapter. My name is Konstanze Maria Therese von Lohenstein, though I suppose that name means nothing anymore. In the history books, if I appear in them at all, I will be a footnote. A mistress, perhaps. A lady-in-waiting who overstepped. The woman who loved an emperor but wasn't quite noble enough, quite strategic enough, quite enough of anything to actually become his empress. But I wasn't his mistress. I was his wife. Let me take you back to the beginning, to before the crown, before the betrayal, before I learned that the only promises worth keeping in royal courts are the ones written in blood and witnessed by God himself. I was 17 when I first came to the imperial court in Vienna. My father, Graf Heinrich von Lohenstein, had secured me a position as lady-in-waiting to the Dowager Empress Maria Josepha. It was an honor, he said. An opportunity, he said. A chance to make a advantageous match, he meant. My family was old nobility, but our coffers were not deep, our lands not vast. I needed to marry well, and the court was where eligible men of rank congregated like moths around a particularly lucrative flame. I had no interest in marriage. I wanted to read. I wanted to learn. I wanted to disappear into the imperial library with its thousands of volumes and never emerge. But duty, as my father reminded me daily, was not about what we wanted. It was about what we owed to our name, our lineage, our position. So I went to court. I learned to curtsy in the exact prescribed manner, to address each rank with their proper titles, to make myself useful but not too present, ornamental but not vain. I learned the invisible rules that governed every breath we took inside those gilded walls. How to hold a fan, how to accept a dance, how to deflect unwanted advances without causing offense, how to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics where a misplaced word could end your family's prospects for generations. I was good at being invisible. Perhaps too good. Emperor Leopold was 31 when we first spoke. He had been emperor for 9 years, having inherited the throne after his father's sudden death from a riding accident. He was expected to marry, to produce heirs, to secure the succession. But he hadn't. Various noble families had paraded their daughters before him like prized horses at auction, and he had found each one wanting. Too young, too frivolous, too ambitious, too something. I met him in the library. I had stolen away during a particularly tedious musical performance. Some visiting composer from Salzburg whose name I've long forgotten, and found myself alone among the books. Or so I thought. I was reading Petrarch in the original Italian, completely absorbed, when a voice behind me said, "You actually understand that, or are you just admiring the calligraphy?" I should have been startled. I should have dropped into a curtsy immediately. But the dismissive tone in his voice irritated me enough that I turned and said without thinking, "I understand it perfectly well, though I find his idealization of Laura tedious. She's not a real woman in his verse. She's a projection of his own desires. She never speaks, never acts, never contradicts him. She's a mirror, not a person." The man, I still hadn't realized who he was, laughed. Actually laughed. That's the most intelligent thing anyone has said about Petrarch in this entire palace. Everyone else just sighs over the romance of it all. Then he stepped into the light, and I saw the subtle crown embroidered on his jacket, the imperial insignia on his ring, and my stomach dropped to my feet. I sank into the deepest curtsy I could manage, my face burning with humiliation. Your Imperial Majesty, I apologize, I didn't. I shouldn't have spoken so. Please forgive my impertinence. Stand up, he said, and his voice was gentle now. Please. I asked your opinion and you gave it honestly. That's rarer than you might think. He paused. What's your name? Konstanze von Lowenstein, Your Majesty. Lowenstein. Your father is Graf Heinrich. Yes, Your Majesty. He's a good man. Honest. We need more of those in government. Leopold moved to the shelf and selected another volume. Have you read Dante? And just like that we began talking. About literature, about philosophy, about the weight of duty versus the freedom of choice. He didn't treat me like a simpering court lady. He talked to me like I was a person with thoughts worth hearing. When the clock struck 10 and I realized I had been alone with the emperor for nearly 3 hours, a scandal that would have ruined me if discovered, he simply said, "Same time tomorrow. I'd like to continue our discussion of free will versus divine providence." I should have said no. I should have understood what was happening, where it would lead. But I was 17 and lonely and intellectually starving in a court that valued beauty and breeding over books and ideas. So I said yes. For 6 months we met in secret in the library. We talked about everything. His frustrations with the conservative court advisors who resisted every reform, my dreams of perhaps one day opening a school for girls. His loneliness in a palace full of people, my sense of invisibility despite being constantly surrounded. We debated. We argued. We laughed. And then, inevitably, we fell in love. I knew it was impossible. He was the emperor. I was the daughter of a minor count with no political connections, no dowry worth mentioning, no strategic value whatsoever. Royal marriages were about alliances, about treaties, about connecting powerful families and strengthening the empire. They were not about love. They were not about intellectual compatibility or shared dreams or the way someone's face lit up when they saw you enter a room. But Leopold said he didn't care. He said that his father had married for duty and been miserable every day of his life. He said that he wanted something different, something real. He said that as emperor, he could choose whom he pleased, and he chose me. His advisors were furious. The Dowager Empress wept. The court whispered that I had seduced him, trapped him, used dark arts or manipulation or some combination thereof to ensnare the emperor. Never mind that Leopold was brilliant and decisive and perfectly capable of making his own choices. No, it had to be me, the upstart from a poor family, who had somehow bewitched him. But Leopold held firm. He commissioned the finest jewelers in Vienna to create a crown for me. Not the imperial crown, which had to await a formal coronation, but a consort's crown of breathtaking beauty. Gold and diamonds and sapphires the color of midnight. He showed me the designs, asked my opinion, promised that I would wear it on our wedding day. We married in secret. Not because Leopold was ashamed. He was planning a grand public ceremony once he had worn down the opposition, but because we couldn't wait any longer. We needed it to be real, to be binding, to be ours before the court could interfere. A priest who owed his position to my father's intervention years ago agreed to perform the ceremony. It was just the 3 of us in a small chapel on Leopold's private estate, with the moon streaming through the stained glass windows and roses from the garden as our only decoration. I wore a simple white gown. Leopold wore no crown, no imperial regalia. We were just a man and a woman promising to love each other, to stand by each other, to face whatever came together. When he slipped the ring on my finger, a gold band engraved with both our initials and the date, I felt, for the first time in my life, completely seen, completely known, completely loved. "I promise you," Leopold whispered as we left the chapel, "that crown will be yours. The whole world will know you as my empress. I swear it." I believed him. We should have made the marriage public immediately. We should have forced the issue, damn the consequences. But Leopold wanted to do it properly. He wanted time to convince his advisors, to smooth over the political complications, to ensure that when he announced our marriage, the court would have no choice but to accept it graciously. He thought he could manage it all, control it all, bend the entire empire to his will through sheer determination and careful planning. He didn't account for time running out. 3 years after our secret wedding, Leopold fell ill. It started as a cough, nothing concerning. But it grew worse. The physicians were baffled. They tried bloodletting, poultices, prayers. Nothing worked. Within weeks, the robust man I had married was confined to his bed, struggling to breathe. His skin taking on a gray pallor that terrified me. I stayed by his side constantly. As far as the court knew, I was simply a dedicated lady-in-waiting, attending to the emperor with touching devotion. They didn't know I was his wife. They didn't know that every night, when the physicians and servants finally left us alone, he would take my hand and apologize. "I'm sorry," he would whisper, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry I didn't announce it sooner. I'm sorry I was a coward. I'm sorry I'm leaving you unprotected." "You're not leaving me," I would say firmly, even as tears ran down my face. "You're going to recover. You have to recover." But we both knew he wouldn't. In his final days, Leopold summoned his son. Franz Leopold was 22, the product of a brief marriage early in Leopold's reign to a princess from Saxony who had died in childbirth. Franz had been raised largely by tutors and the Dowager Empress, seeing his father only occasionally. There was no warmth between them, no real relationship. Leopold had been too consumed with ruling, and Franz had learned early that emotional distance was safer than seeking affection that would never come. I was not in the room when Leopold told Franz about me, about our marriage. But I know what he said because Franz told me later, years later, when everything had changed. Leopold begged his son to protect me, to honor the marriage, to see that I received the title and position that was rightfully mine. He told Franz where the marriage certificate was hidden, witnessed and sealed and legal in every way that mattered. Franz, according to his own account, said nothing. He simply stood there, looking at his dying father, and nodded once. I should have known then. I should have recognized that a single nod from a young man with cold eyes and pressed lips was not the same as a promise. Leopold died on a Tuesday morning in April. I was holding his hand. His last words were to me, "You'll wear the crown. Promise. Franz will." And then nothing. Just breath leaving a body and silence, and the sudden absence of the person who had made me believe I was worth something. The court went into elaborate mourning. Black everywhere, grieving faces, formal ceremonies. And I stood among the other ladies in waiting, anonymous in my grief, unable to scream that I had lost my husband, not just my emperor. Unable to claim my widowhood publicly because to do so would require proof, and the proof was in Franz's possession now. I waited for him to announce it. I waited for him to produce the marriage certificate, to honor his father's dying wish. Days passed, then weeks. The court began discussing Franz's coronation, the elaborate ceremonies that would formalize his ascension to emperor. And still nothing. Finally, I requested a private audience. Franz granted it with the dispassionate efficiency that characterized everything he did. We met in his father's former study, now being redecorated to suit Franz's starker tastes. "Your Imperial Majesty," I began because that's what he was now, even if it felt wrong to give him that title. "Your father told you about our marriage." "He did. And the marriage certificate. I have it." "Then. When will you make it public? When will you honor his wishes?" Franz looked at me for a long moment. He had his father's eyes, but where Leopold's had been warm and kind, Franz's were calculating, cold. "I won't," he said finally. The room seemed to tilt. "I don't understand. It's quite simple. My father made a catastrophically poor decision in marrying you. It weakened his position, created instability, gave ammunition to his enemies. I will not compound that error by acknowledging a marriage that should never have occurred. But it did occur. We were married legally before God. In secret. With no witnesses of rank. Easily dismissed as a fabrication. A desperate claim by an ambitious woman. The cruelty of it took my breath away. You would deny your own father's dying wish. My father's dying wish was that I protect this empire. And I will. Even from his mistakes. Franz turned away, looking out the window at the palace gardens. You will remain at court as a lady-in-waiting. You will be provided for, given a generous stipend, allowed to stay in your current quarters. In exchange, you will never speak of this alleged marriage. You will never make any claim to any title. You will be invisible, as you should have remained from the beginning. And if I refuse? If I speak out? Franz smiled, and it was the coldest thing I had ever seen. Then I will produce witnesses who will testify that you attempted to seduce a dying man, to extract promises from him in his delirium. I will paint you as a scheming social climber who took advantage of my father's vulnerable state. Your name will be destroyed. Your family will be ruined by association. And you will still receive nothing because I will burn that marriage certificate, and it will be my word, an emperor's word against yours. I stood there, shaking with rage and grief and helplessness. Why? I whispered. Why are you doing this? Because I must. Because the empire requires stability, and acknowledging you would create chaos. Because my father's emotional weakness cannot be allowed to undermine the throne. He paused. And because I can. I left that room understanding that I had lost everything. My husband, my title, my future, my very identity as Leopold's wife. I was no one again. Less than no one. I was a woman with a secret that could destroy her if she ever dared to speak it. But I didn't leave court. Where would I go? Back to my father's impoverished estate, to live out my days as a spinster daughter who had failed to secure an advantageous match. That would kill him with disappointment. And some stubborn part of me refused to slink away in defeat. If I couldn't have my crown, I would at least keep what dignity I could. I would stay, and I would endure, and I would remember. Franz's coronation was set for 6 months after Leopold's death, allowing time for proper mourning and preparation. In that time, I watched Franz methodically reshape the court in his image. He dismissed his father's more progressive advisors, replacing them with hardliners who valued tradition and absolute power. He rolled back reforms Leopold had carefully implemented. He made it clear that his would be a different kind of reign, one unconcerned with winning hearts or minds, focused solely on maintaining control. And then, 3 months before his coronation, Franz announced his engagement. Her name was Margarethe von Sternberg. She was 19, beautiful in the classical sense, golden hair, blue eyes, porcelain skin. The daughter of one of the most powerful families in the empire, bringing with her alliances and wealth and impeccable bloodlines. She was exactly what an emperor's bride should be. Everything I wasn't. I thought that would be the cruelest blow. Watching Franz marry, knowing that his empress would wear the crown that should have been mine. But I was wrong. There was something worse coming. Franz summoned me again, a month before the wedding. I need something from you, he said without preamble. I have nothing you could possibly need. You have knowledge. My father kept extensive journals about governance, about the delicate relationships between the noble families, about the political landscape of the empire. I need to understand what he understood. You read with him, discussed politics with him. You know where those journals are, and you know how his mind worked. And why would I help you? Because if you do, I will allow you to remain at court after I marry. If you refuse, I will dismiss you immediately and ensure that no noble house will ever employ you. So I became his researcher, his secret political advisor. I spent hours in the Imperial Library, going through Leopold's papers, extracting insights, preparing reports for Franz that he would present as his own thinking. I told myself I was doing it for survival, but deeper down, I was doing it because it was the only connection I had left to Leopold. His words, his thoughts, his wisdom, even filtered through Franz's cruel pragmatism, still mattered. Franz, I gradually realized, was not stupid. He was brilliant, in fact, but his brilliance was cold, calculated, completely devoid of empathy. He saw the empire as a chessboard and everyone in it, including himself, as pieces to be moved strategically. When he implemented a policy I had found in his father's notes, he didn't do it because he believed it was right, but because the analysis suggested it would strengthen his position. And Margarethe. I pitied her. She was a sweet girl, romantic, idealistic. She believed Franz loved her because he said all the right things, performed all the proper courtship rituals. She didn't see that every word, every gesture, every gift was strategically calculated to secure her family's allegiance. She thought she was entering a love match. She had no idea she was just another piece on his chessboard. The wedding was magnificent. The entire empire celebrated. And I stood among the other ladies in waiting, wearing a dark blue gown, my face carefully neutral, watching Margarethe become everything I should have been. That night, in my chambers, I finally allowed myself to break. I sobbed until I had no tears left, until my throat was raw and my chest ached. I grieved not just for what I had lost, but for what Leopold had been denied. The chance to see his wishes honored, his love validated, his courage in choosing me over political convenience vindicated. But grief, I learned, can be transformed into something else. Something harder. Something useful. Began to pay attention. Real attention. To the undercurrents of court politics, to which families were rising and which were falling, to what Franz feared and what he desired. I began to understand power in a way I never had before, not as something granted by title or ceremony, but as something earned through knowledge, through strategic thinking, through understanding the game better than anyone else playing it. And I began to plant seeds. Nothing obvious. Nothing that could be traced back to me. Just a word here, a document there, a piece of information shared with the right person at the right time. I helped Franz, yes, but I also began building my own network. Ladies in waiting from powerful families. Servants who heard everything and saw everything. Minor nobles who felt overlooked and undervalued. I became someone people came to when they needed advice, information, a sympathetic ear. I became invisible again, but this time by choice. This time as camouflage. 2 years into Franz's reign, Margarethe gave birth to a son. Maximilian Leopold Friedrich, named for his grandfather, ironically. The succession was secured. Franz had everything he wanted. And Margarethe, I could see, had realized what she had married into. The light had gone out of her eyes. She performed her duties flawlessly, but there was no joy in it. She was a beautiful, sad doll, moving through the palace like a ghost. I should have hated her. She wore the crown meant for me. She had the title I should have claimed. But I couldn't hate her. We were both trapped in different ways. Both victims of Franz's cold calculations. Both women who had believed in love and learned too late that it meant nothing against the machinery of empire. Sometimes in those years I would catch Franz watching me. Not with desire, never that. With something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or calculation. As if I were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. I had not broken as he expected. I had not fled. I had not caused problems. I had simply persisted, adapted, survived. It bothered him, I think. That I was still there, still useful, still somehow necessary despite having been so thoroughly defeated. And then, 5 years after Leopold's death, everything changed. Franz fell ill. Not dramatically like his father, but persistently. Headaches, fatigue, memory problems. The physicians were concerned but not alarmed. Probably stress, they said. The weight of the empire. He needed rest. But the illness didn't improve. It worsened. Slowly, inexorably, Franz began to lose his grip on the intricate control he had maintained. He forgot meetings. He made errors in judgment. He became irritable, then paranoid, convinced that people were plotting against him. In his more lucid moments, he knew he was declining. And that knowledge terrified him. Because his son, Maximilian, was only 5 years old. far too young to rule. Which meant a regency. And regencies were dangerous times, full of opportunities for ambitious nobles to seize power. Franz began preparations. He created a regency council, carefully balanced between competing factions so that no one group could dominate. He wrote detailed instructions for Maximilian's education and upbringing. He put systems in place to protect the empire during the vulnerable years until his son came of age. But there was one thing he couldn't prepare for, one variable he hadn't adequately considered: Margarethe. As Franz weakened, Margarethe changed. The sad ghost became something else, someone harder, more focused, more determined. She began attending council meetings. She began asking questions, sharp questions that revealed she understood politics far better than anyone had given her credit for. She had spent years watching, learning, adapting, just as I had. And she hated Franz. Not with hot passion, but with cold, clear-eyed fury. He had used her, dismissed her except as a vessel for his heir, treated her as an ornament. Now she saw her chance to ensure he would not control their son's future from beyond the grave. She came to me 6 months before Franz died. I was in the library, as always, when she entered. We had barely spoken in the 5 years since her wedding. Different social circles, different purposes, the awkwardness of her position making any friendship impossible. "Konstanze," she said, using my given name without permission, without title. "I need your help. Your Imperial Majesty. Don't call me that when we're alone. We both know what a hollow title it is." She sat down across from me, and I saw that her hands were shaking. "I know about you and Leopold. I know about the marriage." My blood turned to ice. "I don't know what." "Please." Found the journal. Leopold's private journal, the one he kept separate from his official records. He wrote about you. About loving you. About marrying you. About what he asked Franz to do. He paused. Franz showed me the marriage certificate once, when he was trying to explain why he feared his father's judgment. He's kept it all these years, locked away, insurance against. I'm not even sure what. But I know it exists. I know you're the rightful empress. That doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. It matters because Franz took everything from both of us. Your crown, my happiness, our futures. He arranged us like furniture to suit his purposes, and we let him because we had no choice. But he's dying, Konstanze. And I am not going to let him control what happens after he's gone. What are you proposing? I want you to be regent. Actually laughed. That's impossible. The council would never accept it. I have no claim, no title, no. You have Leopold's marriage certificate. We produce it after Franz dies. We prove that you were empress all along, that you are Maximilian's grandmother by marriage, that you have every right to guide his regency. More than that, you have knowledge. You've been Franz's secret advisor for 5 years. You understand the politics, the personalities, the dangers. And you have no personal ambition because you've already lost everything. You won't try to seize power for yourself. You'll do what's right for Maximilian because you're not corrupt yet. Not like everyone else here. Franz will destroy the certificate before he dies. Not if he doesn't know I know about it. Not if he believes it's still his secret. Margarethe leaned forward. I can get it. I know where he keeps his private documents. But I need you to be ready. I need you to be prepared to step forward when the moment comes. Why are you doing this? You could be regent yourself. I could. But they would dismiss me as an emotional woman, unfit to guide the empire. They would undermine me at every turn. And Maximilian would be the one who suffered. But you they've already underestimated. You've been invisible so long they don't even see you as a threat. We can use that. I looked at this young woman, nearly 10 years my junior, but already so much harder than I had been at her age, and saw an unlikely ally. Someone who understood what it meant to be used, diminished, treated as less than human by the man who was supposed to value you most. Why trust me? Yes. We barely know each other. Because you loved Leopold and he loved you. Because you've survived 5 years of Franz's cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. Because I've watched you, and you're still kind to the servants, still patient with the younger ladies in waiting, still human in a court that strips humanity away. And because... She paused, her voice breaking slightly. Because I need to believe that there's someone in this poisonous place who won't betray me the moment it becomes convenient. So we formed our conspiracy. 2 women, powerless by every official measure, plotting to reshape the empire. Franz died on a cold December morning. He was 33 years old. He died afraid, I think, though he would never have admitted it. Afraid that his carefully constructed plans would unravel, that his son would be manipulated by the very forces he had spent years trying to control, that his legacy would be failure. I felt nothing when I heard the news. Not grief, not satisfaction, nothing. He had been a force of nature, destructive and impersonal, and now that force had stopped. That was all. The funeral was elaborate. Franz was given full imperial honors. His coffin draped in the imperial standard, the entire court in deepest mourning. Margarethi played the grieving widow flawlessly. And I stood among the ladies in waiting as always, anonymous and unnoticed. 3 days after the funeral, the Regency Council convened for their first official meeting. They had agreed on the composition, 5 nobles representing different factions, balanced carefully so no one could dominate. They began discussing Maximilian's education, the policies that should be maintained or adjusted, and the diplomatic challenges facing the empire. And then Margarethi stood up. "Before we proceed further," she said, her voice clear and steady, "there is a matter that must be addressed. A matter of legitimacy and succession that has been hidden for too long." The council members looked confused. One of them, Graf Albrecht von Hohenberg, said irritably, "Your Majesty, the succession is clear. Your son is the rightful emperor. There is no question. The question is not about my son. It is about who has the right to guide him during his minority." Margarethi pulled a document from her sleeve. "This is a marriage certificate signed and sealed 8 years ago, between Emperor Leopold and Konstanze von Lohenstein. It makes her the Dowager Empress. It makes her, not this council, the proper regent for my son." The room erupted. Shouts of disbelief, accusations of forgery, demands to see the document. I remained standing against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Graf Albrecht seized the certificate, examined it closely, then looked up with fury in his eyes. "This is a fabrication. A pathetic attempt to seize power through." "It is genuine," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Father Matthias Keller, the priest who had married us, stood there. He was old now, frail, but his voice was strong. "I performed the marriage myself. I witnessed their vows. I signed that certificate. It is legal and binding in the eyes of God and the Church." Another voice, this one from a different door. "I can confirm its authenticity." The imperial archivist, a man named Joseph Richter, whom I had befriended over years of research in the library, stepped forward. "I have compared the seals and signatures to other documents from that period. They are genuine. Furthermore, I have found references to this marriage in Emperor Leopold's private papers, including his explicit wish that it be honored after his death." The room fell silent. The council members looked at each other, calculating, trying to understand what this meant, how to respond. "This is absurd," Graf Albrecht finally said. "Even if the marriage is genuine, and I am not conceding that point, it was kept secret. It was never announced, never celebrated, never acknowledged. The woman has no experience governing, no political connections, no reason why we should trust her with the empire. She has been advising the crown for 5 years." This from Baron Friedrich von Waldstein, one of Franz's former advisors. I recognized her research in numerous policy proposals. Her insights, her understanding of the empire's needs, they were invaluable, even if Emperor Franz never publicly credited her. "She is also," Margarethi said quietly, "the only person in this room who has no faction, no agenda beyond the welfare of my son. She cannot be bought or pressured because she has nothing to gain and nothing left to lose. She is the only one I trust with Maximilian's future. Your Majesty cannot simply decide, Graf Albrecht began. I am the Emperor's mother. I have a voice in this, and I choose her. Margarethi's eyes swept the room. Unless you wish to argue that a mother has no right to protect her son. That would be an interesting position to take publicly. The threat was clear. If they fought this, she would make it public. She would turn it into a scandal about whether the nobility valued laws and legitimacy or only their own power. She would force them to either accept me or reveal themselves as caring nothing for justice. It was brilliant, ruthless. Leopold would have been proud. The council deliberated for 6 hours. I waited in an antechamber, not allowed to be present for my own trial, my own judgment. When they finally summoned me back, every muscle in my body was tense with dread. Graf Albrecht spoke, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger. The council has determined that the marriage certificate appears to be authentic, and that you do have a legal claim to the title of Dowager Empress. However, given the unusual circumstances and the concerns about your experience, we propose a compromise. You will serve as regent alongside this council. All major decisions will require both your approval and ours. You will have voice and vote, but not absolute power. It wasn't what Margarethi and I had hoped for, but it was more than I had ever expected to have again. It was acknowledgement, vindication. A crown I had been denied for so long, finally placed on my head, not by the man who promised it to me, but by his grandson's mother, who understood what it meant to be dismissed and diminished and deemed unimportant. I accept, I said. The coronation happened 2 weeks later. Not as elaborate as it would have been if Leopold had lived to see it, but formal enough to establish legitimacy. They brought out the consort's crown that Leopold had commissioned for me 8 years earlier, untouched all this time, gathering dust in a vault somewhere. Still fits perfectly. As they placed it on my head, I looked out at the assembled court. 200 people, the same ones who had watched Margarethi crowned, who had whispered about me for years, who had treated me as invisible or worse. Now they were bowing to me. Now I was Dowager Empress Konstanze, regent of the empire. But the moment that broke me, the moment I finally allowed tears to fall, came after the ceremony. Young Maximilian approached me, shy and uncertain. He was only 5, still trying to understand why his father was gone, why everything had changed so suddenly. Are you really my grandmother? He asked. By marriage, yes. I was married to your grandfather, Leopold. Father never talked about him much. Or about you. He paused, then took my hand with the trusting innocence only children possess. Will you tell me about him? About grandfather Leopold? And there, in that simple question from a child, I found purpose again. Not revenge. Franz was dead beyond my reach. Not power. I would guide this empire only until Maximilian came of age, and then step back again. But this, the chance to tell Leopold's story. To teach his grandson about the man he had been, the values he had held, the dreams he had dreamed. To ensure that something good, something true, survived all the betrayal and manipulation and pain. Yes, I told Maximilian, squeezing his small hand. I will tell you everything about your grandfather. Every story, every dream, every lesson he wanted to pass on to you. And so began the strangest chapter of my life. Dowager Empress. Regent. The woman who had been erased from history is now shaping its future. The first months were brutal. The council fought me on everything. Every policy decision, every appointment, every minor adjustment to protocol. Graf Albrecht in particular seemed determined to make me fail, to prove that I was unfit for the role they'd been forced to give me. But I had spent 5 years learning how Franz thought, how power moved through the court like water finding cracks in stone. I had watched him manipulate, calculate, position pieces on his chessboard. And I had learned, not to be like him. I would never be that cold, that ruthless, but to understand the game well enough to play it my own way. I started building alliances. Not through threats or bribes, but through something simpler. I listened. When minor nobles came to court with grievances, I actually heard them instead of dismissing them. When servants reported problems in the palace infrastructure, I investigated instead of ignoring them. When the council members themselves expressed concerns, I took them seriously even when I disagreed. It was exhausting. Every day was a battle, and I went to bed each night feeling like I'd aged a year. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. People who had initially resisted me started to soften. Not Graf Albrecht. He would hate me until his dying day, but others. Baron von Waldstein became a genuine ally. Countess Johanna von Liechtenstein, who controlled significant influence among the court ladies, began to actively support my decisions. And Margarethe. She became my closest friend. My only real friend, perhaps, in that nest of vipers. We would meet privately in her chambers after the interminable council meetings, drinking wine and laughing bitterly about the absurdity of it all. Two women who should have been enemies, brought together by shared trauma and a determination to do right by the child who depended on us. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked me one night about 6 months into the regency. Not fighting harder when Leopold was alive. Not forcing him to announce the marriage publicly. Thought about it every day. But I also understand why he hesitated. He was trying to protect me in his way. He thought he had time to do it properly, to ensure the transition would be smooth. He didn't know time was the one thing he didn't have. Franz knew, Margarethe said quietly. He knew from the beginning he would never honor it. Even if Leopold had announced it publicly, Franz would have found a way to undermine it, to make me seem illegitimate or unstable. The man was incapable of seeing people as anything other than tools or obstacles. "Did you ever love him? Even a little?" She was quiet for a long time. "I loved who I thought he was. The man who courted me, who said beautiful things, who seemed to see me. But that man never existed. He was a performance, carefully calibrated to achieve a specific result. The real Franz was empty. There was nothing at the center of him except the need for control. I understood that. I had seen it too in those years of working for him. The way he could analyze any situation brilliantly but never feel anything about it. The way he treated his own son like a chess piece to be protected but never actually loved. The way he had looked at me that day in his study and destroyed my life without a flicker of remorse, because remorse required empathy and empathy was a weakness he couldn't afford. "Maximilian won't be like that," I said firmly. "We won't let him be." And we didn't. The boy became the center of both our lives, the one purely good thing in the complicated mess of court politics. I taught him history, philosophy, literature, all the things Leopold had loved. Margarethe taught him compassion, how to see servants and common people as human beings with their own struggles and dreams. Together we tried to give him what neither Leopold nor Franz had received, a childhood that balanced duty with love, power with empathy, strength with kindness. He was a sweet child, curious and gentle. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with Leopold's eyes, asking questions with Leopold's same hunger for understanding, and my heart would ache with the unfairness of it all. That Leopold never got to meet this grandson, who was so much like him. That Franz had been the one to raise him for 5 years before dying, probably filling his head with cynical lessons about power and control. But children are resilient. And Maximilian, surrounded now by people who genuinely cared about him rather than just what he represented, began to blossom. His tutors reported that he was brilliant, not just memorizing facts but actually thinking, questioning and making connections. His fencing instructor said he was developing real skill. His music teacher claimed he had a gift for the piano that shouldn't be wasted. I watched him grow and thought, this is what Leopold wanted. Not just an heir but a good man. Someone who would rule with wisdom and compassion, who would see the empire as people rather than pieces on a board, who would make decisions based on what was right rather than what was expedient. The years passed. 3 years of regency became 5, then 7. Maximilian grew from a small boy into a young man, tall and serious and kind. The council gradually accepted my leadership, even Graf Albrecht grudgingly admitting that the empire was stable, prosperous, and at peace. We had navigated threats from neighboring kingdoms, internal disputes between noble families, economic challenges and natural disasters. And through it all, Maximilian was learning what it meant to be emperor, not from cold instruction, but from watching us handle real crises with care and wisdom. When Maximilian turned 15, he began attending council meetings. Just listening at first, learning how decisions were made, how competing interests were balanced. But gradually he started asking questions. Insightful questions that revealed he had been paying much closer attention than anyone realized. "Why do we tax the merchants more heavily than the landowners?" he asked one day. "The landowners have more wealth, don't they?" Graf Albrecht bristled. "The landowners are nobility. They provide stability, military service. But the merchants provide trade, commerce, the actual movement of goods that keeps the economy functioning," Maximilian interrupted. "It seems like we're punishing the people who create wealth and rewarding the people who inherit it." The room fell silent. It was exactly the kind of observation Leopold would have made. The kind of thinking that challenged comfortable assumptions and forced people to defend their positions with reason rather than tradition. I caught Margarethi's eye across the table. She was smiling slightly, pride evident in her face. "Boy. Our strange, improvised family's boy. He was going to be a good emperor." But as Maximilian's 18th birthday approached, the age at which he would officially take power and the regency would end, I felt something unexpected. Fear. Not for him. He was ready, more ready than most heirs twice his age. But for myself. Who would I be when I was no longer regent? What purpose would I have when my primary duty was fulfilled? I had spent 13 years fighting for this role, then 7 years serving in it. It had consumed my entire adult life. And now it was ending and I would be... what? An elderly woman with a title but no real function. Retired to some estate somewhere, visiting court occasionally for ceremonial events, fading into irrelevance once again. Margarethi saw my distress, of course. She always did. "You're not losing anything," she told me one evening. "You're gaining freedom. Freedom to finally live for yourself instead of for duty or survival or other people's expectations. I don't know how to do that. I don't even know who I am outside of these roles. Leopold's secret wife, Franz's secret advisor, Maximilian's regent. Then maybe it's time to find out." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A servant entered, bowing deeply. "Your Majesties, forgive the intrusion, but His Imperial Highness requests your presence in the Great Hall. He says it's urgent." My stomach clenched. What could be so urgent that Maximilian needed both of us immediately? Had something happened? Was there a threat we hadn't anticipated? We rushed to the Great Hall, still in our informal evening clothes, expecting crisis. Instead, we found the hall filled with people. Not just the council but dozens of courtiers, servants, even some common people from the city. Candles everywhere, flowers, musicians playing softly. And at the center of it all, Maximilian, wearing formal attire, looking nervous and determined in equal measure. "What's going on?" Margarethi whispered. Maximilian stepped forward, and the room fell silent. "Grandmother. Mother. Thank you for coming. I know this is unusual, but I wanted everyone here for what I'm about to say." He gestured, and 2 servants came forward carrying something draped in velvet cloth. They set it on a table and carefully removed the covering. It was the consort's crown. My crown, the one Leopold had commissioned for me 40 years ago, the one I had worn at my own coronation as regent. But next to it was another crown. Larger, more elaborate, covered in more jewels. The imperial crown. The one that would be placed on Maximilian's head at his coronation in 3 weeks. "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be emperor," Maximilian said, his voice carrying through the hall. "About what kind of ruler I want to be, what kind of empire I want to create. And I keep coming back to the same conclusion. The best emperors are the ones who learn from the past while building toward the future. He picked up the consort's crown, holding it carefully. My grandfather Leopold loved my grandmother Konstanze. He married her in secret because he was afraid of the court's reaction, afraid of political consequences, afraid of disrupting the careful balance of power. And that fear, that hesitation, cost them both dearly. It cost them the life they should have had together. It cost my grandmother decades of obscurity and pain. It cost my grandfather the chance to leave behind the legacy he truly wanted. Tears were streaming down my face now. I couldn't stop them. My father, Franz, learned the wrong lessons from that. He thought the solution was to feel nothing, to care about nothing except power and control. He thought that by eliminating emotion, by treating people as chess pieces, he could avoid his father's mistakes. Instead, he created new kinds of damage. He hurt everyone around him. And he died young, afraid and alone, having never experienced real love or real connection with anyone. Maximilian turned to face me directly. But you, grandmother, you survived both of them. You loved deeply and lost everything, and instead of becoming bitter or cruel, you became wise. You learned how to navigate power without being corrupted by it. You learned how to protect without controlling. You learned how to serve without losing yourself. He crossed to where I stood and knelt before me. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. In 3 weeks, I will be crowned emperor. And when I am, my first official act will be to grant you a new title. Empress Mother. Not dowager, not regent, not some honorary position we give to retired royalty. Empress Mother, with a permanent seat on the Imperial Council, with the authority to advise me and, when necessary, to check my power. Because I need you, grandmother. The empire needs you. Not just as a symbol of the past, but as an active voice shaping the future. Maximilian, I'm too old. You're 62. My grandfather died at 34. My father at 33. If anyone in this family has proven they have the stamina for the long game, it's you. He smiled, Leopold's smile warm and genuine. Besides, you said you'd tell me everything about grandfather Leopold. You haven't finished. I still have so much to learn. He stood, taking the consort's crown, and before I could protest, he placed it on my head. Not a servant, not a priest, not some ceremonial official. My grandson, the next emperor, acknowledging my crown himself, before the entire court. She wore the crown my grandfather promised her, Maximilian said, his voice ringing through the hall. She wore it later than she should have, earned through suffering rather than given in love. But she wore it with more honor than anyone else I've ever known. And she will continue to wear it, not as a relic of the past, but as a living reminder that love, loyalty, and integrity matter more than power, more than convenience, more than fear. The hall erupted in applause. Not the polite, measured applause of court ceremonies, but genuine, enthusiastic applause. Even Graf Albrecht, ancient now, but still attending council meetings out of sheer stubbornness, was clapping, his face unreadable but his hands moving. I looked at Margarethe. She was crying too, smiling through tears, and when our eyes met, I saw in her face the same gratitude I felt. We had done it. Against all odds, despite every obstacle, we had raised a good man. An emperor who understood that power was meaningless without compassion, that tradition was worthless if it perpetuated injustice, that the past should inform the future rather than constrain it. That night, after the celebration, after the crowds had dispersed and the candles had been extinguished, I sat alone in my chambers holding Leopold's ring, the simple gold band he had placed on my finger 40 years ago in that secret chapel. I had worn it every day since, hidden under gloves or on a chain around my neck, a private reminder of a love that had shaped my entire life. We did it, I whispered to the empty air, to his memory, to whatever part of him might still exist somewhere beyond this world. Your grandson is everything you hoped for, everything you would have been proud of. And I finally wore the crown you promised me. Not the way we planned, not in the time frame we imagined, but I wore it. And I'll keep wearing it, for him, for you, for everyone who believes that love isn't weakness and compassion isn't foolishness. The ring glinted in the candlelight. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I felt warmth, as if Leopold's hand was closing over mine one last time, as if he was saying what he couldn't say 40 years ago. I'm sorry. And I'm proud. And I love you still. Maximilian's coronation 3 weeks later was everything a coronation should be. Magnificent, solemn, full of ceremony and tradition. The entire empire celebrated their new emperor, young and idealistic but grounded in wisdom beyond his years. And when he took his oath to serve the empire, to protect its people, to rule with justice and mercy, I heard Leopold's voice in his, saw Leopold's values in his words. But the moment I'll remember forever came later, during the banquet. Maximilian stood to give his first official speech as emperor, and before addressing the assembled nobles and dignitaries, he turned to me. My grandmother once told me that she felt invisible, he said. That despite everything she had done, everything she had survived, history would forget her. She would be a footnote if she appeared at all. A woman who loved an emperor but wasn't quite enough to become empress. He paused, letting his words sink in. I want to make something clear to everyone here, and to history itself. Konstanze Maria Therese von Lohenstein is not a footnote. She is not invisible. She is the reason I'm standing here today, prepared to lead, able to distinguish between power and wisdom. She is the true architect of whatever good my reign accomplishes. And any history that doesn't acknowledge that is a lie. More applause. But this time I didn't cry. This time I simply stood, wearing my crown, Leopold's crown, earned through suffering and survival and the stubborn refusal to disappear even when the world wanted me to, and acknowledged the truth of what Maximilian had said. I wasn't invisible anymore. I never would be again. The years that followed were peaceful in ways I had never imagined possible. Maximilian proved to be exactly the emperor the empire needed. Thoughtful, fair, willing to reform outdated systems but wise enough to preserve what worked. And I sat on his council, advising him, challenging him when necessary, supporting him always. Margarethe finally found peace too. She remarried, to her surprise, to a widowed duke who had loved her quietly for years. She stepped back from court life, spending her time supporting charitable causes and writing. She published a memoir about her experiences that became quite controversial but ultimately helped spark important conversations about the treatment of women in noble marriages. Graf Albrecht died at 93, stubborn to the end, but before he died he asked to speak with me privately. I went to his estate expecting I don't know what, a final insult perhaps, or a bitter recrimination. Instead he said simply, "I was wrong about you. I spent years fighting you because I was afraid change meant chaos. But you proved that change can mean growth. Thank you for your service." It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't friendship. But it was acknowledgement, and from a man like Albrecht, that was more valuable than affection. I lived to see Maximilian marry a brilliant woman named Teresa who reminded me achingly of myself at that age, full of ideas and passion and intelligence. I lived to see their first child born, a daughter they named Konstanze Leopoldin. I held my great-granddaughter and thought about the chain of love and pain and survival that had led to this moment, this tiny person who would grow up in a world where women could be more than ornaments, where love didn't have to be secret, where promises actually meant something. And when I died, peacefully in my sleep at the age of 78, I died as Empress Mother Konstanze, with my crown on the table beside my bed and Leopold's ring on my finger, surrounded by people who valued me, in a world I had helped shape. The story they tell about me now is different from the one I thought would be told. They don't call me a footnote or a mistress or a woman who overreached. They call me the invisible empress, the woman who changed the empire from the shadows before finally stepping into the light. They tell stories about my quiet resistance, my strategic patience, my refusal to be erased even when erasure seemed inevitable. And they tell, most importantly, the love story. Leopold and Konstanze, the emperor and the count's daughter, who married in secret and were torn apart by death and betrayal but whose love survived everything. Survived Franz's cruelty, survived decades of obscurity, survived even death itself to shape the future through their grandson. It's not the fairy tale we imagined. There was no immediate happy ending, no grand romantic gesture that fixed everything. But it's a true story. And truth, I learned, is more powerful than any fantasy. Because here's what I know now, what I wish I could tell my younger self standing in that great hall watching Margarethe crowned. Sometimes the promise isn't broken. Sometimes it's just delayed. Sometimes you have to wait 40 years and fight for every inch and survive more than you thought possible. Sometimes the crown comes to you not from the hand of the man who loved you, but from the hand of his grandson who learned from your example what love and loyalty and integrity actually mean. Sometimes you have to crown yourself piece by piece, day by day, through the sheer stubborn refusal to let the world make you invisible. And sometimes, not always but sometimes, that's enough. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, through every betrayal and every small victory, through 40 years of patience and pain and eventual triumph, then you understand something important. Your story isn't over when someone takes your crown. It's not over when they dismiss you or diminish you or try to erase you from history. It's only over when you stop fighting, stop surviving, stop insisting on your own worth even when no one else sees it. I wore the crown Leopold promised me. Just not the way either of us expected. And in the end, that made it mean even more. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing me, for letting me exist in your mind as more than a footnote or a cautionary tale. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what city, what country, what part of the world, so I can send you a virtual hug across time and space. Because we're all fighting to be seen, to be valued, to crown ourselves when the world refuses to do it for us. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own invisible battles, your own stolen crowns, your own long journeys from erasure to acknowledgement, share it. Subscribe. Let this story live beyond me, beyond this moment, as a reminder that patience isn't the same as surrender, and survival isn't the same as defeat. The crown isn't always given. Sometimes you have to wait for it. Sometimes you have to fight for it. Sometimes you have to live long enough, love hard enough, and refuse to disappear loudly enough that the world has no choice but to finally see you. And when that moment comes, when someone who loves you, who understands you, who values what you've survived